Florence, 16th century. The jewel of the Renaissance. A city that embodied both the grandeur and the vices of its era. Gold and marble, silks and secrets whispered in the shadows of Palazzo Vecchio. Here, every stone breathed history, and every glance could convey both favor and mortal threat. The Medici. Their name resonated like an incantation, a symbol of immense wealth and boundless power, woven from ambition, intrigue, and at times, outright poison. Under their sway, Florence prospered, yet concealed its darkest secrets within its labyrinthine depths. At the court of Francesco I, Grand Duke of Tuscany, magnificence was but a thin veil, concealing an unseen struggle. Here, amidst alchemical laboratories and lavish feasts, every step was calculated, every word weighed. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, of something grand, or perhaps fatal. In this world, where art and science merged with politics and mysticism, the character of the man at the helm of all this splendor and darkness was forged. Beyond the walls of Palazzo Vecchio, amidst polished marble floors and tapestries, resided not so much a ruler as an alchemist on the throne. Francesco I de Medici was a paradoxical figure. Having inherited neither his ancestors' political acumen nor their ruthless grip, he preferred the solitude of laboratories, where metals transformed into gold and herbs into elixirs. His soul gravitated towards science, art, and mysticism, but not at all to the burden of governing an expanding duchy. This melancholic and reclusive ruler, burdened by a marriage of convenience to Joanna of Austria, was as if trapped in a golden cage of duty. His court, teeming with schemers and informers, yearned for a new narrative, a new passion capable of disrupting the accustomed order. And then, against this backdrop of tense silence, the first rumors began to surface about a certain Venetian woman whose arrival portended something more than just a visit. While Duke Francesco immersed himself in the smoke of alchemical retorts, the Medici court lived its own, no less complex life. Palazzo Vecchio, a labyrinth of marble and intrigue, was permeated by whispers. Courtiers, like shadows, glided through the galleries, exchanging meaningful glances. Rumors, poisonous and elusive, spread into every corner, foreshadowing a storm. They spoke of an extraordinary Venetian woman, whose name was initially uttered with apprehension, then with curiosity, and soon with alarm. This stranger, known only to be from a merchant family, was already becoming a magnet for gossip. Her arrival was anticipated not as a visit from a noble lady, but as the invasion of an unknown force capable of overturning the established order. The air in Florence thickened, portending not just change, but a clash capable of altering the duchy's fate. But how did this outsider manage to pave her way into the very heart of Florentine power? Into this suffocating labyrinth of intrigues, where every whisper could become a death sentence, a figure burst in, whose appearance was akin to an explosion. Bianca Cappello, not merely a noble lady, but a Venetian adventuress, who risked everything for love, or perhaps for far more tangible power. Her journey to Florence was scandalous. She had fled her hometown with a clerk from the Salviati banking house. This daring act, it seemed, should have forever closed the doors of high society to her, condemning her to oblivion. But Bianca was not one to resign herself to fate. Possessing not only dazzling beauty but also a sharp mind, she saw Palazzo Vecchio not merely as a den of vipers, but as a chessboard where every move could lead to unimaginable power. Her ambitions were as boundless as her charm, and she methodically began to weave a web capable of ensnaring even the Grand Duke. What began as a personal scandal swiftly transformed into a political drama, promising to alter the accustomed order of things. When Bianca Cappello stepped upon the dusty cobblestones of Florence, it was not merely an arrival, but a veritable challenge. The gossip that had previously been whispered in the dark corners of the palazzo exploded with thunderous force overnight, shaking not only the court, but also the royal houses of Europe. This Venetian adventuress, with her scandalous past and audacious charm, instantly became a magnet for curiosity and condemnation. Francesco de Medici, usually detached and absorbed in his alchemical experiments, fell under her spell. His attachment to Bianca was so profound and evident that it eclipsed even the standing of his legitimate wife, Joanna of Austria. Cappello's influence grew daily, transforming her from a mere favorite into a shadowy ruler whose word carried unexpected weight. The court held its breath, observing this incredible transformation, anticipating the inevitable power struggles she would have to endure. Yet it was one thing to captivate the heart of a Grand Duke, and quite another to maintain power within a web of intrigues where every whisper could be deadly. Bianca Cappello was no naive favorite. She was a strategist whose wit and shrewdness became her shield and sword. The Medici court, permeated by envy and centuries-old traditions, was reluctant to accept the Venetian adventuress. Cardinal Ferdinando, Francesco's brother, was her principal antagonist, seeing in her a threat to the dynasty and the purity of its bloodline. But Bianca skillfully maneuvered, utilizing Francesco's affection and her own tenacity. She didn't merely influence the Duke. She learned to manage the court, drawing supporters to her side, neutralizing opponents, turning rumors into weapons, and loyalty into the foundation of her unofficial but firm power. However, the path to absolute recognition required the removal of all obstacles, even those that seemed insurmountable, and at times death sometimes arrived where it was least expected. Bianca's shadow seemed to loom over the chambers of Joanna of Austria, the Duke's legitimate wife. Her marriage, initially merely a political alliance, had long since faded, leaving behind only cold ashes. Then one day in 1578, the quiet, submissive Duchess passed away. Officially, it was attributed to a fever, but whispers in the corners of Palazzo Vecchio told a different story. This death cleared the path far too conveniently for the woman who had long worn the crown of a shadowy ruler. Was it mere coincidence? Or did an invisible hand, guided by ambition and passion, assist fate? This sudden demise only heightened the tension, portending not just change, but a new turn in this dangerous game, where the stakes were higher than life itself. And so, in the year 1579, with mourning for Joanna still lingering in the palace halls, Florence witnessed an unprecedented spectacle. What had seemed impossible came to pass. Grand Duke Francesco I de Medici married his longtime favorite, the widow Bianca Cappello. This was not just a marriage but an official coronation, a public acknowledgement of her status, solidified beneath the cathedral's arches. For the Venetian fugitive who had managed to conquer the heart and throne of Tuscany, it was an apotheosis, a triumph of will and ambition that seemingly cemented her as the rightful duchess. However, in a world where every step was calculated and every success bred envy, such a triumph could not be without clouds. By solidifying her position at the pinnacle of power, Bianca not only failed to reduce the number of her detractors, but gave them new, more substantial reasons for hatred. Her enemies, led by the relentless Cardinal Ferdinando, merely awaited the moment when this newly acquired crown would begin to chafe. For the Medici dynasty, one critically important question remained unresolved, looming like a shadow over all this splendor. And so, the culmination of intrigue and passion crowned Bianca Cappello with the title of Grand Duchess. But this crown was heavy, and its brilliance concealed a gaping void at the very heart of the Medici dynasty. Francesco, despite his second marriage, had not produced a legitimate male heir capable of continuing the lineage. This was not merely a personal failing, but an existential threat to the entire house of Medici, whose grandeur was built upon continuity and strength. The court, permeated by whispers and calculations, awaited a firstborn. Rome, Vienna, other European capitals, all watched closely. Understanding that the absence of a direct heir could provoke a succession crisis, cast doubt on Bianca's legitimacy, and even destabilize Florence itself. Pressure on the ducal couple mounted, transforming their bedroom into a strategic battlefield, and each day without news of Bianca's pregnancy only multiplied the number of her detractors, especially those who saw an opportunity for themselves. Her triumph, it seemed, was complete, but the Grand Duchess's crown only intensified the tension. The court, accustomed to intrigues, now boiled with open hostility. Bianca's principal adversary became Cardinal Ferdinando, Francesco's brother. He could not reconcile himself to the fact that a Venetian adventuress, who lacked noble roots and, more importantly, had not provided the dynasty with a legitimate male heir, occupied such a high position. To him, she was not merely an upstart, but a direct threat to Medici power and his own ambitions. Every step she took, every decision Francesco made under Bianca's influence, was perceived as a personal challenge. Beneath the veneer of courtly etiquette, a ruthless struggle for influence unfolded, with the future of Tuscany at stake. Secret denunciations, whispers behind their backs, attempts to discredit the Grand Duchess, all were part of daily reality. The atmosphere was electrified, and it seemed only a matter of time before this hidden war erupted. Florence, like a jewel, shone under Medici rule. The court, despite all underlying intrigues, was steeped in splendor. Feasts gave way to balls, where aristocrats in golden brocade robes whirled in dances, and the air vibrated with the sounds of lutes and flutes. It seemed the protracted feud between Grand Duke Francesco and his brother, Cardinal Ferdinando, had finally subsided. They appeared together in public, exchanging strained but demonstrative smiles, creating an illusion of reconciliation. Bianca, firmly established as Grand Duchess, reveled in her triumph, accepting honors and participating in lavish ceremonies. This was a time of seeming prosperity, a golden age where every day was a celebration, and suspicion seemed to dissolve in wine and music. But behind this dazzling facade, in the shadow of lavish tapestries, a different, far darker reality was already brewing. However, the fragile balance of power, barely held together by threads of false reconciliation, proved too precarious. In the autumn of 1587 at the Poggio, a Caiano estate, where the ducal couple had retired for a respite, an inexplicable turn of events occurred. First Francesco, then Bianca, fell ill. The sickness struck suddenly, like a predator from the shadows, and its symptoms were disturbingly similar. And at this moment, when her usually iron will should have been her support, Grand Duchess Bianca Cappello faltered. Her composure vanished, giving way to the despair and fear she had so long concealed behind a mask of invulnerability. This was not merely an ailment, it was a deafening blow of fate, a harbinger of imminent catastrophe, destroying everything they had so carefully built. At that moment it became clear. The game was over. And while the court stood frozen in anticipation, someone was already making their next move, awaiting an opportune moment. In the shadow of the Poggio, a Caiano tragedy, where the lives of Francesco and Bianca came to an end, loomed a figure whose destiny was inextricably intertwined with the Medici dynasty, Cardinal Ferdinando. Not the reclusive alchemist his brother was, Ferdinando was a man of a different mold, pragmatic, ambitious, with a sharp mind and an iron will. His path, forged through the ecclesiastical hierarchy, was not merely one of service, but a strategic move ensuring influence and status within the complex web of European politics. He made no secret of his disdain for Bianca, seeing in her not just an upstart, but a threat to the purity of the Medici bloodline, their reputation, and far more. Importantly, the future of the throne. His brother's marriage to a Venetian adventuress, moreover one without a legitimate male heir, was for him a personal insult and an existential threat to the entire lineage. His eyes, accustomed to the subtleties of diplomacy and court intrigues, were always fixed on Florence, on the throne, on the very essence of power, and he undoubtedly possessed all the means to achieve his goals. Their sudden, almost simultaneous demise at Poggio a Caiano, as if following a sinister script, immediately directed attention to the one who stood in the shadows, patiently awaiting his hour. Cardinal Ferdinando, Francesco's younger brother, was not merely next in line. He was the principal beneficiary of this tragedy. The childless marriage of the Grand Duke and Bianca Cappello represented a dead end for the Medici dynasty, and their passing opened Ferdinando's path to power. He gained not only the ducal throne but also colossal wealth, control over Florence. And, no less importantly, was rid of Bianca, whom he notoriously despised. This was a gain capable of changing the fate of all Tuscany. However, the path to such an absolute triumph is typically paved with long-standing animosity and suspicion. Between Bianca and Cardinal Ferdinando, Francesco's brother, lay an abyss of irreconcilable hostility, into which all attempts at reconciliation were cast aside. The cardinal, jealously guarding the dynasty's honor, could not tolerate the presence of the Venetian adventuress on the Florentine throne. He never missed an opportunity to remind his brother of her origins, her past, and her supposed barrenness, systematically undermining her authority in the eyes of the nobility and courtiers. Bianca, hardened by Venetian intrigues, responded with elegant disdain and veiled threats, understanding that her survival depended directly on her sway over Francesco. The Medici court transformed into a theater of shadows, where every glance, every word, carried a double meaning. and trust was but a mirage, dissolving in the thick fog of court gossip. In this poisonous atmosphere of mutual antipathy and constant suspicion, Cardinal Ferdinando's shadow became increasingly prominent, casting a grim premonition over the couple's fate. It is here, in the shadow of funerary urns and mournful chants, that Cardinal Ferdinando's figure begins to acquire ominous clarity. His influence, his connections in the Vatican and at European courts, his unwavering ambition, all coalesced into a terrifying mosaic. As the younger brother, he had always been in Francesco's shadow, but now, overnight, he became the Grand Duke. This was no mere coincidence. It appeared to be a meticulously planned chess game, where Francesco and Bianca were merely pawns removed from the board. Ferdinando did not simply inherit the throne. He seemed to have been biding his time, hatching plans in the quiet of monastic walls. His transition from cardinal to secular ruler was swift, almost triumphant. The entire thread of the investigation now inevitably leads to him, to his motives and capabilities. But before we definitively brand him, we must carefully examine the final moments of the ducal couple's lives. Autumn 1587. The air of Poggio a Caiano, usually filled with the scents of Tuscan autumn, suddenly became suffocating, permeated with a sense of foreboding. Grand Duke Francesco de Medici, a man whose soul was a labyrinth of alchemical dreams, suddenly fell ill. His body was seized by an unbearable fever, agonizing vomiting, and sharp colics, tormenting him with such force as if by invisible demons. Every breath was a struggle. Every cry echoed through the villa's walls, where only recently ostentatious luxury had reigned. Court physicians, powerless and bewildered, merely threw up their hands, observing his slow agony. Contemporary accounts paint a picture of 11 days of hellish torment. 11 days that transformed into an eternity for the Medici, before he breathed his last, leaving behind only grief, questions, and an ominous silence. But this silence was deceptive, for death rarely comes alone. No sooner had Francesco's last breath faded into the air than the shadow of death enveloped Bianca as well. Her ailment, mirroring the Duke's torments, developed with frightening rapidity. The same unbearable fever, the same vomiting, the same sharp colics and spasms that had tormented him now racked her body. But while Francesco had agonized for 11 days, Bianca faded much faster, not lasting even 2 days after his demise. 2 lives, so intertwined in love and power, ended almost in a single instant, as if by an unseen signal. This striking coincidence was too perfect, too convenient to be a mere accident. And Florence, of course, could not help but notice this ominous synchronicity, which gave rise to whispers and conjectures that hung in the air like a poisonous mist. No sooner had news of the double demise of Duke Francesco and Grand Duchess Bianca reached the streets of Florence than the city was abuzz. The official version of a malignant fever was met with a murmur of disbelief. How could 2 people, even if close, die almost simultaneously from the same illness, and so advantageously for those who craved power? Everywhere, from opulent palazzos to cramped shops, whispers circulated about something far more sinister. The illness that afflicted them both was unusual and suspicious, wrote one Venetian ambassador, whose dispatches reflected the general mood. No one believed in a natural outcome when the throne had become so suddenly and conveniently available for Cardinal Ferdinando. Behind these whispers and conjectures lay not merely superstition, but a deep understanding of the intricate workings of power and personal vendettas that permeated the Medici court. If the official version spoke of a malignant fever, Florence whispered of something else. The outcome was far too convenient for Cardinal Ferdinando, who made no secret of his hatred for Bianca and his thirst for power. Coincidence? Hardly. The court, accustomed to intricate intrigues, could not accept such a synchronized demise of 2 highly influential figures as accidental. The air carried the scent of illness, but far stronger, the scent of crime. Venetian ambassadors, whose dispatches were always a treasure trove of genuine sentiments, unequivocally pointed to foul play. Thus, almost instantly, the official truth dissolved into a torrent of rumors. The legend of a violent death, of poison administered by a calculating hand, began to take on flesh and blood, becoming part of urban mythology. And this version, dramatic and sinister, not only took root in popular memory, but also inspired. In the cold archives of history, Where the dust of centuries conceals truth and legends intertwine with reality, few mysteries burn with such a vivid flame as the enigmatic double death of Francesco de Medici and Bianca Cappello. This story, full of passion, betrayal, and power intrigues, has inspired generations, but none imbued it with such dramatic intensity as the great Stendhal. His pen, like a surgeon's scalpel, laid bare the nerve of the era, transforming the Florentine events into a pure tragedy, where every character, from the fateful Venetian woman to the avaricious cardinal, becomes an embodiment of human vices and passions. He didn't merely describe facts, he painted a picture of doom, where love and power intertwined in a deadly dance, and suspicions of poisoning hung in the air long before the fateful autumn of 1587. Stendhal's version, deeply ingrained in the public consciousness, became not just one interpretation, but a powerful catalyst for further investigation. To truly understand the origins of this drama, we must return to those times when Grand Duchess Bianca, desperately striving to solidify her position, resorted to an unthinkable deception. But let us return to the desperate game Bianca initiated long before her demise. Aware of the precariousness of her position without a direct heir, she resolved upon the unthinkable: a feigned pregnancy. She needed a son to definitively secure her place on the throne and shield Francesco from Cardinal Ferdinando's pressure. This was her move, her only chance to outmaneuver fate. The scenario was carefully crafted: a false pregnancy, months of pretense, and then a substitution. For this risky endeavor, Bianca enlisted none other than a Franciscan confessor. He, a man of the church, was to become an accomplice in the greatest deception that could alter the course of Medici history. This conspiracy, woven from despair and ambition, was ready for its culmination. Bianca's plan to substitute an infant, intended to secure an heir for the dynasty, was audacious and desperate. But the cunning Ferdinando, long suspicious of her intrigues, had already woven his own web. The moment Bianca was to present the court with the long-awaited son, the cardinal delivered his blow. He coldly, with calculated cruelty, ordered a search of her chambers and then of the Duchess herself. Beneath Bianca's clothing, an infant was discovered, hidden in her sleeve. Not her son, but another's child, intended for deception. The scene was appalling. Bianca's humiliation, Ferdinando's open censure, his triumphant gaze piercing hearts. Francesco, her husband, was shaken to his core. This public slap in the face, this disgrace inflicted upon his wife and his court, became a turning point. On that day, amidst the whispers of courtiers and the cardinal's triumph, the seeds of future tragedy were sown deep into the soil of their destinies. Public humiliation became a wound Bianca Cappello could not forgive. Her carefully constructed facade, her claims to legitimacy and power, were cruelly shattered by Ferdinando. The exposure of her feigned pregnancy, the forced search, this was an insult that wounded deeper than any political defeat. The Venetian adventuress, always a survivor and intriguer, found herself cornered, her pride trampled. But humiliation breeds dangerous resolve. In the dark corners of her mind, a new, chilling plan began to form. A plan born of despair, and a burning desire for vengeance against those who dared to expose her and destroy her world. This was no longer merely about survival. It was a quest to reclaim lost dignity, even if it meant dragging others down with her. The stage was set for a final desperate act, where the lines between victim and executioner would blur, and the grand theater of Medici power would witness its most shocking finale. The prelude to this grim denouement would unfold not in the cold halls of justice, but amidst the deceptive cordiality of a shared meal. In the autumn of 1587, the Medici villa at Poggio a Caiano, an exquisite jewel in the Tuscan landscape, seemed the ideal setting for a serene dinner. But behind the lavish draperies and flickering candlelight, amidst the clinking of glasses and the laughter of courtiers, lay an atmosphere of tense anticipation. This was not merely a dinner, but a meticulously orchestrated spectacle, where every glance, every word, every gesture held a double meaning. Bianca Cappello, whose pride had been trampled and whose position was imperiled, prepared to deliver a counterblow. She, once a brilliant Venetian, now cornered, saw this evening as her only chance. The tables groaned under the weight of delicacies. The air was thick with the aromas of game and wine. But for some present, this feast was destined to be there last. Among them, it seemed, was Cardinal Ferdinando, the unwitting cause of her humiliation. Dark designs already hung over this table, ready to unleash with the first misstep. And then, dessert was served. At that fateful dinner in Poggio a Caiano, where the air was charged with unspoken threats, Bianca Cappello, humiliated and craving vengeance, executed her meticulously calculated plan. Her target was none other than Cardinal Ferdinando, her sworn enemy. The dessert, a delicate blancmange, seemed innocent, but within its creamy depths lay a deadly promise. This was her answer to the public disgrace, her checkmate in this cruel game. However, fate, or perhaps the vigilance of some unknown informant, played its part. At the very last moment, as the plate with the poisoned delicacy already beckoned, Ferdinando, with imperturbable calm, declined his portion. A warning, a whisper in the corridors, or a meaningful glance had reached him. How, remains a mystery, but his refusal was like a dagger thrust into Bianca's back, a harbinger of the catastrophe already hovering in the air. That ill-fated dinner at Poggio a Caiano, where Bianca had harbored her deadly plan, turned into a nightmare that surpassed all her expectations. Cardinal Ferdinando, as if guided by an invisible hand of fate, declined the dessert intended for him. But then came a blood-curdling moment. Grand Duke Francesco, her beloved and protector, unaware of the terrible secret hidden within the exquisite dish, reached out. Perhaps it was a manifestation of his boundless trust in Bianca, or perhaps a fatal oversight, but he partook of that very dessert. Bianca's eyes, previously filled with calculated vengeance, now filled with horror. She watched as the poison, intended for another, was now consuming her own destiny, her husband's destiny. Words caught in her throat. Paralyzed by despair, she could not stop him. The instant Francesco swallowed the first bite, truly black clouds gathered over the Medici, portending an inevitable end. And this was only the beginning of the agony. On that fateful evening, when Grand Duke Francesco, unknowingly, ingested the lethal poison intended for his brother, Bianca Cappello found herself facing an abyss. Her calculating plan, designed to eliminate a rival and solidify her position, spiraled into a catastrophe that struck at the very core of her life. Witnessing Francesco's agony, realizing the inevitable collapse of everything she had so diligently built, Bianca understood. Her fate was now inextricably linked to his end. In that moment of despair, or perhaps a final flicker of doomed love, she decided to share his destiny. And so, within the walls of Poggio a Caiano, transpired what would become one of the Renaissance's darkest and most debated mysteries. A double death, shrouded in intrigue and suspicion, forever etched into the annals of history as a legend of passion, betrayal, and a fateful choice. But was this version definitive? Archival evidence often lies, and the dead, as is well known, keep their secrets. Yet sometimes, even centuries later, they can speak if listened to with the tools of science. The deepening gloom over Poggio a Caiano in October 1587 concealed not merely two deaths, but a centuries-old enigma. Francesco and Bianca, their lives a tapestry of passion and intrigue, ended so abruptly and simultaneously that suspicion hung in the air like a poisonous mist. Centuries later, the shadow of doubt has not dissipated. Modern historical detectives, armed not only with archives but also with the scalpel of science, have taken up the case. Exhumations conducted meticulously in the early 21st century, as if dissecting time itself, allowed for the retrieval of tiny yet potentially deadly clues from the dust of the Grand Duke and his consort. Toxicological analyses, like microscopes piercing the veil of centuries, searched for traces that could confirm or refute the darkest suspicions of poisoning. The results of these studies, published in scientific journals, added another twist to this convoluted affair, painting new strokes on the portrait of tragedy. However, even the most precise instruments cannot always provide a final answer, for history, like truth, sometimes has many faces. But should we rush to conclusions when the shadow of poison so conveniently falls upon the beneficiary? Florentine doctors, and Ferdinando himself, insisted on natural causes. Malignant fever, as it was officially termed, could have been anything, from common malaria, which was rampant in the swampy areas of Tuscany at the time, to severe forms of typhoid fever or even peptic ulcers capable of causing fatal internal bleeding. 16th century medicine was far from perfect. Symptoms of many diseases overlapped, and accurate diagnoses were rare. Fever, vomiting, colic. These signs could point to dozens of ailments, especially in the absence of proper hygiene. However, even if we accept these versions, the question remains, why did the deaths occur so synchronously, and why at the very moment when the political landscape demanded such decisive changes? The true reasons for their demise may lie not only in biology, but also in the intricate web of power. The deaths of Francesco and Bianca were not merely a tragedy, but a political earthquake, its echoes reaching the influential courts of Europe. For Cardinal Ferdinando, the throne was not a prize. It was a dynastic necessity. He saw Bianca not just as an upstart, but as an existential threat to the Medici, a woman incapable of bearing an heir, whose influence over his alchemist brother seemed ruinous. His ambitions, long smoldering beneath his cardinal's robes, ignited, bolstered by the duty to protect the family name. The change of power in Florence, a key player among the Italian states, instantly altered the geopolitical landscape. The pragmatic Ferdinando inherited the duchy, reorienting its foreign policy, which impacted relations with the papacy, Spain, and the Habsburgs. The stability of the Grand Duchy, vital for trade and financial interests, now depended on a man willing to do anything to consolidate power. This sudden vacuum, filled with such speed and ruthlessness, forever inscribed Bianca Cappello's name into the dark pages of court intrigue, making her image far more multifaceted than just that of a duchess. And so, through the mists of centuries, Bianca Cappello appears before us in dozens of guises. Was she a cunning courtesan, elevated to the throne by vice? Or a magnanimous duchess, a victim of dynastic intrigues? Or perhaps a desperate poisoner, driven to a double suicide for love or revenge? History, like a whimsical lady, has never rendered a definitive verdict on her. Her image, woven from rumors and legends, has become firmly embedded in the cultural code. From the walls of Palazzo Vecchio to the pages of European literature, Bianca's name resonated as a synonym for fatal passion and ambition. She became a muse for poets and playwrights, an embodiment of dangerous female power, capable of both elevating and destroying. Her fate was seen as a reflection of the eternal struggle between duty and desire, power and love. And this multifaceted nature, this impossibility of a clear answer, only adds to the enduring allure of her story. We have followed the trails of intrigue and secrets, unearthed archives, and analyzed the conclusions of modern scientists. But even today, centuries later, the veil over the double death of Bianca Cappello and Francesco de Medici remains only partially lifted. Like shadows of the past, they elude a final verdict, leaving behind only echoes of rumors and conjectures. History, like life, does not tolerate unequivocal answers. It merely offers us fragments of truth, from which each of us assembles our own mosaic, attempting to unravel the motives that drove people in that distant Florence. Perhaps the full truth about poison or fever, about love or betrayal, will forever remain buried under the dust of ages. However, their story is not just a detective tale of death. It is a drama of power, passion, and the cost of ambition, which forever changed the face of Tuscany, paving the way for new intrigues and a different destiny for the Medici dynasty.